It's become almost cliche to say that we're living in unprecedented times, but just because it's cliche doesn't mean that's wrong. 2020 sucked. Between COVID, civil unrest, and the American election, people spent more time indoors than ever before, and it's because of this that video games became important for one of the first times in history. Over the past 12 months, people played good games, people played bad games, and people played okay games. A new generation of consoles came out, Valve actually released something, and after all was said and done, video games helped a lot of people deal with an increasingly stressful world around them. These are the 10 games that helped the most. These are my 10 favorite games of 2020. Something that's always annoyed me with video games is how easy they make using guns seem. Although you can't really fault the games, I mean, who wants to spend hours learning how to use a virtual pistol? It is kind of strange that in almost every shooter ever made, you can become John Wick with just the press of a button or two. As someone who's spent most of his life shooting, I've always wanted a game that accurately portrays how hard it is to use a pistol. I think it's important for people to realize that guns aren't point and shoot, and also I need some way to practice with my pistols until ammo prices return to normal. Receiver 2 is that game. It's not perfect by any means, particularly when it comes to its story, but it's also the only game that I've played this side of VR that actually shows how guns work. Every time you equip a pistol, you'll need to load bullets into your magazine, load the magazine into the pistol, chamber around, flip the pistol safety off, then take a second to aim, and then hope that you hit your target. This can seem tedious at times, but it's also incredibly cool, and I mean, if nothing else, that is what games are meant for, and that's why it earns a spot on this list. Of all the trends in gaming, few have irked me as much as the shift away from third-person shooters over the past 5-odd years. Back in the good old days of 2013-ish, every game and its sequel let you look over the shoulder of your character. But now it seems like I'm perpetually stuck in first person whenever I want to shoot some bad guys. This is why I love Mafia Definitive Edition. To be clear, the game has some problems, and it definitely feels dated at times despite technically being a complete remaster of the early 2000s classic that shares its same name. But despite these faults, the game is a solid third-person shooter. It harkens back to the days when moving from cover to cover was almost as common as crappy Coldplay songs, which makes the game almost a nostalgic experience that's just kinda good. Every once in a while, an okay game launches, but it manages to become a hit because of an amazing marketing team. The Witcher 3 was saved by CD Projekt Red's communicative PR team. Stanley Parable has some of my favorite advertising in all video game history, and Going Under's Twitter account is a perpetual stream of great memes. To be clear, the actual game part of Going Under is pretty solid. It's an above-average third-person hack-and-slash roguelite that's in the same vein as Risk of Rain 2. When I played it earlier this year, I actually managed to almost beat the game, which is more than I can say for certain other games I've been tasked with reviewing over the past 12 months. However, most of my enjoyment in the game came from the developer's official Twitter account. It's to date one of the few accounts that I, a quasi-professional games journalist, retweet consistently. They post dank memes, they're self-aware about how terrible the gaming industry is, and after all is said and done, they did make a pretty good game, which is why it earns a spot on this list. It's a well-known fact, or at least it should be, that I absolutely adore Arma. I currently have over 4,000 hours on the game. Arma is the reason I was able to become a games journalist. I've met more than a handful of my close friends on it, and it's the only thing in existence that I have a hard time looking at objectively. The point I'm trying to make is that if I ever compare a game to Arma, it's the highest praise I can possibly give. And, well, Squad has earned that remark. Squad is like Arma. It's worth noting that there are a few differences between the two games that differentiate them enough to warrant a recommendation for each individual game. But of the two, I'm more inclined to recommend Squad at the moment. For as good as Arma is, it requires you to play in a group in order to have fun, but in Squad you can just hop into a public server. Squad takes the combined arms warfare from Arma, but it allows you to jump into a public game and more or less have a good time. The gunplay isn't quite as good as Arma's, but it's given me a lot more memorable moments in 100 odd hours I've spent with the game than in the 4,000 odd hours I've spent in Arma. And coming from somebody like me, this should really be all the recommendation that the game needs. I've never really been a fan of city builders. In all the years that I've spent gaming, I've lost track of the amount of times that I've tried to get into games like SimCity or Tropico. Although I consider myself to be a sophisticated gamer with plenty of patience, for one reason or another, I've never been able to actually enjoy one of these games, at least until I played Aspera earlier this year. See, at its core, it's not much different than games like City Skylines or Banished. You're tasked with setting up a colony on Mars, and in order to do that, you need to mine resources, advance through a tech tree, and so on and so on and so on. All this is fun, to be clear, but it's also not the game's main selling point for me. Instead, what earns Aspera a spot on this list is its story. Unlike the plethora of games that tell you just to build without any context, Aspera offers loads of it. Its story is absolutely engrossing, and it constantly brings up philosophical issues surrounding the nature of mankind, AI, and even nuclear warfare. It had me glued to the screen over the game's incredibly lengthy runtime, and that's no small feat coming from a guy that generally likes to blow up cities instead of build them. Of all the strange trends in gaming, few are as weird as the lack of innovation when it comes to first-person shooters. Although the genre is responsible for some of the best grossing games of all time, it's remained mostly unchanged since the first Call of Duties. So, when Superhot launched a few years ago with a gimmick that changed the way gamers around the world shot baddies in first person, it became an instant hit, and it's this innovation that makes Superhot Mind Control Delete such a great game. Although it doesn't reinvent the wheel in the same way that its predecessor did, it offers enough changes to the Superhot formula to make it a success. There are more levels, more weapons, and the combat feels more fluid, which is all that it needs to really do to make it one of my favorite games of the year. I've never been a big reader, so I was pleasantly surprised when In Other Waters offered me a tale that's unlike most of the games I've played over the years. At its core, it's no different than the myriad of adventure games currently available on the market. You take control of a scientist who's tasked with investigating a planet to determine if there's alien life on it. Over the course of the game's 4-odd-hour runtime, you point and click your way around a detailed planet while occasionally choosing dialogue options and solving rudimentary puzzles. However, what makes In Other Waters unique is that it's a 2D game where your only window into its incredibly interesting world is a GPS screen. This means that the game does a whole lot of telling instead of showing, but this isn't a problem because of just how well written it is. It's the first game in over a decade where I've actually had to use any form of my imagination, which made it an almost surreal experience when considering the fact that I was playing it on an upper-end gaming computer. So in the few games this year that I'd actually consider to be unique, and that's the highest praise I can give it. Well, CD Projekt Red did it again. They made a buggy mess of the game that's somehow one of the best I've played in years. Although Cyberpunk 2077 has some seriously major issues, especially if you're unlucky enough to play the game on a past-gen console, it's hard not to love it. It feels like Fallout New Vegas, with its satisfying gunplay, engrossing plot, and insane amount of bugs. The game definitely could have been better, but considering just how desperate I am for a good Cyberpunk game, Cyberpunk 2077 is one of the best games I've played in years, and it's likely one of the few games I'll still be playing in a decade. A wise man once said that the only two sure things in life are death and taxes, so it's almost like that Death and Taxes, the game that is, turned out to be my second favorite game of 2020. It's a combination of my two favorite games of all time, Papers, Please and The Stanley Parable. The game is an office 'em up, where instead of determining who's allowed into the borders of not East Germany, you decide who lives and who dies while playing as a Grim Reaper in a satirical version of the underworld. Honestly, there's not much more to say about the game than that. It's funny, it's replayable, and it brings up a lot of questions about the nature of mankind that aren't worth spoiling in this video. I was surprised at just how much I loved the game, but as someone who thinks that The Stanley Parable is one of the best games ever made, I guess it makes sense that Death and Taxes turned out to be so great. In my life, I've played a lot of games. Not as many as some, but I've had a controller in my hand since I was a kid, and never in my life have I played a game that's impacted me as much as The Last of Us Part 2 has. Some of the impact definitely comes from the fact that, from an objective standpoint, the game is great. It's visually fantastic, the animations are borderline erotic to watch, and it's better paced than an 18-year-old drinking with his parents for the first time. The gameplay is solid too, with some seriously satisfying takedowns, shooting that feels better than 95% of the games I've ever played, and a level design that never had me questioning where I was supposed to go. However, the real reason that I hold the game in such high regard is because of the story. I relate to Ellie a lot, and I've had my fair share of adventure, and I'm trying to understand what settling down looks like, so Ellie's tale specifically spoke to me. I've never been one for crying, but the ending of The Last of Us Part 2 literally had me in tears. I was depressed for weeks after playing the game, and I still think about it on a daily basis, which has never happened to me before, and I doubt it ever will again. If there's ever a game that personifies why games are a better storytelling medium than film, The Last of Us Part 2 is it, because it made a grown man cry. And it's with that depressing note that we finally say goodbye to 2020. Goodbye, myriad of forgettable video games. Goodbye, threat of nuclear war. Goodbye, Donald Trump. And goodbye, another 365 days of my life. With any luck, the next 12 months will be better than the previous 12. But if nothing else, remember that video games will always be here for us.